Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Oh,
Today we're diving deep into the world of international trade. We're looking at Douglas Irwin's Free Trade Under Fire.
that's right. This is the fifth edition published in 2020, so it's really bang up to date.
And our goal for this deep dive, really, is to get to grips with the core arguments, for and against free trade, as Irwin lays them out.
Exactly. We'll be focusing on the economic principles behind it all and the real-world impacts of these trade policies.
Think of it as, well, a shortcut to understanding a really complex and frankly crucial issue.
Definitely. So, before we jump into the details, what are the main themes Irwin wants us to understand from the book?
Well, generally he presents quite a positive view of international trade.
Echoing the consensus among economists, really, that it tends to be mutually beneficial for the countries involved.
Right. But he does acknowledge that, some groups within a country might lose out or face challenges because of trade.
Yeah, that's key. But the overall societal benefits, he argues, are usually significant.
The book also digs into the costs of protectionism, which is the opposite of free trade in many ways.
And the complexities of actually making trade policy, it's not straightforward.
Not at all. And importantly, it looks at how trade affects jobs and wages, which is always a big topic.
And its role in developing countries, helping poorer nations grow.
Finally, yeah, it gives us an analysis of the whole global trading system, the WTO, regional agreements, all that.
Okay, that's a great roadmap. So let's start with the context. Irwin was writing this fifth edition in 2020. Trade was definitely in the headlines then.
It really was. The book highlights how relevant it all was, thinking about the trade actions happening then, the debates.
Like the Trump administration's tariffs on Chinese imports, for instance.
Exactly. And even the divisions within the administration itself about trade policy. It really pushed trade to the forefront.
Yeah, it feels like these worries about trade, they kind of ebb and flow, don't they? Sometimes even when the economy's doing well.
That's a point Irwin makes. These anxieties aren't new. They pop up, fade away, even in good economic times, like the 90s, right? Low unemployment in the U.S. then.
Yeah, but still, big debates around things like NAFTA, the creation of the WTO. Lots of concern.
So it's not just during recessions that people worry about trade's impact.
Not at all. And the criticism comes from, well, all over the political spectrum.
Right. Irwin points that out clearly. It's not just one ideology.
You had figures like Ralph Nader, maybe more on the left, raising environmental concerns, labor standards.
And then conservatives like Patrick Buchanan maybe focusing more on social impacts, national identity.
So questioning free trade isn't really a partisan thing historically.
So Irwin's main goal here with Free Trade Under Fire is really to help us cut through the noise, understand the complexities.
Exactly, to demystify it.
Yeah.
He wants to examine the arguments for free trade, sure, but also look seriously at the protectionist alternatives, get a more informed debate going.
The book also mentions this idea of peak globalization. What's that about?
Yeah. Peak globalization. It's the thought that maybe the super fast growth in world trade we saw for decades, maybe that slowed down or hit a ceiling.
After the 2008 financial crisis, particularly.
Right. Trade growth definitely slowed after 2008. And economists debate, is this just a blip or a fundamental shift?
Because some of the big drivers, like China opening up, were kind of one-off events.
That's part of the argument, yeah. Those might not be easily repeatable.
But even with that slowdown in growth, the world is still incredibly interconnected, economically speaking.
Oh, absolutely. Even if trade as a share of GDP hasn't kept climbing at the same rate everywhere since 2008, the level of global integration we have now is still, historically very high.
Okay, let's zoom in on the United States' role in all this. The book talks about trade becoming more important for certain sectors.
That's right. For industries actually involved in, buying and selling goods across borders, trade has become much more significant over the last few decades.
Looking at the raw numbers for merchandise trade, yeah, it looks huge compared to the past.
But, and this is a really crucial point Irwin makes, that higher trade-to-GDP ratio can be a bit misleading for the overall U.S. economy.
Because of the shift towards services.
Exactly. The service sector is just so much bigger now, and trade plays a less direct role there compared to, say, manufacturing physical goods.
So fewer workers are directly exposed to that import competition.
Right. The book points out, I think it's around 9% of American workers are in those goods-producing sectors now, like manufacturing, mining.
Wow, down from
down from about 26% back in 1970. So while trade is vital for certain parts of the economy, it directly impacts a smaller slice of the workforce than it used to.
And then there's the issue of global supply chains making the trade figures look bigger.
Yes, that's another key point. These complex chains mean a product or its components might cross borders multiple times during production.
And each crossing gets counted as trade.
Precisely. Even if the number of final finished goods isn't necessarily increasing at the same rate.
You mentioned the auto industry example.
Yeah, U.S.-Canada auto trade is a perfect illustration. The U.S. exports lots of engines and parts to Canada.
And imports finished cars from Canada.
Exactly. That back and forth inflates the trade value, but it's really about how production is shared.
Irwin also mentions things like the Boeing 787.
Right, parts from everywhere. Or an American car that actually has a huge percentage of its value from components made elsewhere. It just shows how tangled up production is globally.
What about getting those goods across borders? How have falling transport costs played a role?
Oh, a huge role. Lower transport costs have been a massive driver of trade growth.
Especially air freight.
Particularly air transport, yeah.
Yeah.
It slashed shipping times, making it feasible to trade perishable goods, fresh flowers, seafood, things you just couldn't ship long distances before.
But those costs still matter a lot, especially for some countries.
Absolutely. Irwin emphasizes that trade costs transport, yes, but also poor infrastructure, government red tape, customs delays, they can be huge barriers.
Particularly for developing countries that are landlocked.
Exactly. He cites sub-Saharan Africa, where high trade costs for farm products are estimated to knock more than 2% off their GDP.
Wow.
And even small improvements help. Like when Guatemala and Honduras streamlined their border checks, trade between them picked up noticeably.
Amazing how logistics matter so much. Now, looking historically at U.S. policy, the trend has been towards lower tariffs, right?
Yes, a clear long-term trend. If you look at tariffs on dutiable imports as a share of all imports, it's come down significantly over many decades. Generally, a move towards more openness.
And that's not just the U.S.
No, not at all. You've
No.
had huge economies like China and India opening up to global commerce. That's been transformative.
And many developing countries lowering barriers, too, often as part of joining the WTO.
Right. So while non-tariff barriers are still an issue, the overall global trend, certainly up until recently, was towards significantly lower tariffs.
Okay, let's shift to the core economic arguments for free trade. The book kicks off with comparative advantage. That's the big one, isn't it?
It really is. Irwin lays out Ricardo's concept very clearly. It's the cornerstone of why most economists favor free trade.
And the key idea, which can feel a bit strange at first, is that it's not about who's absolutely best at making something.
Exactly. It's about opportunity costs. What do you give up to produce one thing instead of another?
Right. So if I decide to make more chairs, I have to make fewer tables. The opportunity cost is the tables I didn't make.
Precisely. And comparative advantage says countries should specialize in producing the goods where their opportunity cost is lower relative to other countries. Then trade.
The book uses some good analogies, like the Lionel Messi one.
Yeah, that's a great one. Messi's probably brilliant at everything on a soccer field, but his comparative advantage, where his skill is relatively greatest compared to others, is maybe scoring goals.
So he should focus on that, even if he's also the best defender on the team.
Right, because the team gets the most benefit that way. It's about relative efficiency, not absolute. Even if one country is technically better at making everything, it still benefits by specializing in what it's relatively best at and trading.
It leads to more overall production globally.
Yes. And that argument from a domestic steel producer saying we're the world's most efficient doesn't actually negate comparative advantage. It's about the whole economy's resources.
The book also brings in John Stuart Mill's perspective on the gains from trade. He saw broader benefits from it.
Absolutely. Mill identified three main types of gains. First, the direct economic ones. The static gains from just reallocating resources better based on comparative advantage.
Okay, that's the immediate efficiency boost.
Second, the indirect effects. Things like improved production methods, greater efficiency because of competition, exposure to new ideas from abroad.
Sort of learning by trading.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And third, Mill talked about the intellectual and moral effects, the exchange of ideas, innovation, even promoting peace through interdependence.
Can we see those direct economic gains in historical examples?
Irwin gives a couple. Japan, after the Meiji Restoration opened up and saw national income rise, partly from shifting resources to more productive, export-oriented industries.
And the flip side,
The U.S., under Jefferson's 1807 trade embargo, Deliberately cutting off trade led to a big economic loss, maybe 5% of GDP, shows the cost of isolation.
So even if the overall GDP number doesn't jump dramatically right away, consumers can still benefit hugely from more choice.
Exactly. Irwin stresses this. Consumer welfare can go up a lot just from having access to a wider variety of goods.
And the numbers back this up.
Yeah, he cites research showing the number of imported product varieties in the U.S. quadrupled over recent decades, and the number of countries supplying each good doubled.
Wow.
One study estimated this increase in choice alone was worth about 2.6% of GDP in welfare gains. That's huge, just from having more options on the shelves.
That is significant.
Yeah.
And then there are the dynamic gains, the longer-term growth effects.
Yes, these are really crucial for sustained progress. Irwin discusses several ways trade fuels these.
Like competition making domestic firms sharper.
Right. International competition forces firms to up their game, become more efficient. It also weeds out less productive firms and allows more productive ones to expand.
And firms that export tend to be more productive anyway.
Generally, yes. The firms that succeed in exporting are often already the more productive ones, and exporting allows them to grow further, achieve economies of scale, innovate more.
He mentioned the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement example.
Yeah, Canadian plants that increased exports to the U.S. after the agreement saw subsequent rises in their productivity and innovation rates.
And it's not just finished goods, but trading parts and materials, intermediate inputs.
Hugely important. Access to a wider range of better, cheaper, or more specialized inputs can really boost the productivity of domestic industries that use them.
Like the evidence from India.
Yes, showing greater access to imported intermediates led to faster growth in the variety of products made domestically.
And lower tariffs on capital goods, machinery, equipment.
That can really boost productivity by making investment cheaper and more efficient. An Indonesia study found reducing tariffs on imported inputs had a much bigger positive impact on productivity than cutting tariffs on final goods.
Even China saw productivity jump after joining the WTO.
Significantly, yes, partly due to better access to imported inputs. Irwin really stresses that tariffs on capital goods can be especially damaging because they hurt investment and growth.
So a strong theoretical case for these dynamic gains. But what about the real-world link between trade liberalization and overall economic growth? Is the evidence clear-cut?
Irwin acknowledges it's complex. Many studies find a positive correlation between lower trade barriers and faster growth, especially after WWII. But isolating trade policy's effect from everything else is hard.
Sure, so many things affect growth.
Exactly. But he does point to more recent studies finding a positive link, particularly research showing that countries cutting import duties on capital and intermediate goods saw faster growth. Seems quite specific.
Okay. Now, a big concern people raise is the environment. How does the book tackle the trade environment link?
Irwin addresses it directly. He argues trade policy is a pretty blunt tool for environmental problems. Direct measures, like pollution taxes, are usually more efficient.
So using trade restrictions to fix pollution isn't ideal.
Generally not the first best approach. Interestingly, he presents findings suggesting trade has sometimes been linked to reductions in certain pollutants like SO2 and NO2 and less energy depletion.
Really?
Potentially through promoting more efficient resource use or facilitating the spread of cleaner technologies. No clear link found with deforestation either.
What about CO2 emissions?
That's the one area where some studies find a potential negative link, likely through increased economic activity and transport associated with trade.
But he challenges the race to the bottom idea. The countries lower environmental standards to compete.
Yes, he argues there isn't strong evidence for that, or for the pollution haven hypothesis where dirty industries just move to countries with lax regulations because of trade.
So pollution reduction in rich countries isn't just about offshoring the dirty work.
The evidence suggests it's mostly been driven by better technology and stricter domestic regulations, not just moving production. In fact, the pollution intensity of U.S. imports has actually fallen.
But what about things like fossil fuel subsidies? How do they fit in?
Irwin discusses how those subsidies worldwide are environmentally damaging, boosting emissions and pollution, and costing governments money. He suggests tackling those subsidies internationally might be more feasible than a huge climate treaty.
And sometimes protectionist policies can backfire environmentally.
Right. He mentions U.S. ethanol subsidies as an example criticized for their environmental costs, or fisheries subsidies that distort trade and encourage overfishing.
So trying to protect one industry can harm the environment elsewhere.
It can happen. He even mentions the argument that shifting some agriculture away from densely populated protectionist countries using lots of chemicals could potentially reduce overall global environmental damage in specific cases.
Okay, let's switch gears to protectionism itself. The book talks about the economic costs, but also why it persists politically.
Irwin starts with Adam Smith's critique of mercantilism. Smith argued those old policies, restricting imports to boost exports, confused producers' interests with the nation's overall interest.
And harmed national wealth overall. What are the main economic downsides of tariffs and import barriers today, according to Irwin?
Two main negative effects. First, they redistribute income from domestic consumers, who pay higher prices, to domestic producers, who benefit from less competition.
And second,
They cause inefficient resource allocation. They distort the economy by pulling resources into artificially protected industries instead of where the country has a real comparative advantage. Makes the whole economy less productive.
are these costs significant?
Irwin cites a 2017 estimate putting the annual cost of U.S. import restraints, not even counting anti-dumping duties, in the billions. And tariffs often hit everyday consumer goods hard as clothes, shoes.
He also mentions deadweight loss.
Yeah, think of that as pure economic waste. Value lost to society because tariffs distort choices. Consumers buy less, pay more, and less efficient. Domestic firms are propped up.
And it's not just higher prices. There's this rent-seeking issue, too.
Right. Protectionism creates incentives for firms to spend time and money lobbying for those protections, rather than innovating or becoming more efficient.
Trying to grab a slice of the artificial profits created by the barrier.
Exactly. The U.S. sugar quota is a classic example. Lots of effort goes into maintaining that protection, even though it hurts consumers and food manufacturers.
It seems the benefits of protection are often concentrated on a small group, while the costs are spread thinly across everyone else.
That's key to the politics. A few sugar producers gain a lot. Millions of consumers each pay a tiny bit more for soda or candy.
So the producers have a strong incentive to lobby, while consumers barely notice or don't organize.
Precisely. He uses the wire clothes hangers example too. Tiny cost per consumer, but it adds up, and it's easier for the domestic producer to get protection.
The book also mentions the Lerner symmetry theorem. What's that? Sounds complicated.
It's a neat idea. Basically, it says a tax on imports acts like a tax on exports.
How does that work?
Because ultimately, imports have to be paid for with foreign currency, which you mostly earn by exporting. So restricting imports tends to make it harder for your export industries to compete. Irwin shows U.S. exports and imports historically move together.
So protecting one industry can indirectly harm another, exporting one.
Yes. Think about those high U.S. sugar prices again. It doesn't just hurt consumers, it makes U.S. candy makers less competitive than rivals in countries with cheaper sugar.
Leading to job losses or companies moving production elsewhere.
Exactly. The book notes far more jobs in sugar-using industries were likely hurt by high sugar prices than jobs saved in sugar growing. The cost per sugar job saved is astronomical.
It really highlights the hidden costs. The book then gets into the political forces shaping trade policy.
Yeah, the complex dance between interest groups, lobbying, government institutions. Different industries want different kinds of protection. Smaller ones might use anti-dumping laws. Bigger ones might seek direct political help. It's hard to generalize.
And this transitional gains trap. Why is protection so sticky once it's in place?
Because the group benefiting gets used to it, organizes to keep it. The benefits are immediate and concentrated.
While the benefits of removing the protection are often spread out, maybe uncertain, and in the future.
Right. So there's a built-in bias towards keeping existing protection, even if it's inefficient overall.
But are there any situations where the book suggests trade intervention might make economic sense?
Irwin discusses a couple of theoretical cases. One is promoting industries with positive externalities, spillovers that benefit others.
Like R&D or something.
Potentially, but he warns it's incredibly difficult to identify the right industries and design effective support without causing distortions or capture by special interests. Krugman was skeptical about using things like value added per worker to pick winners.
Okay, so that's tricky. What's the other potential justification?
Strategic trade policy. The idea that in industries with only a few big global players, maybe government intervention like subsidies, could help domestic firms grab a bigger share of the profits.
But that sounds risky too.
Very. The book suggests the practical success of strategic trade policy is highly debatable. It often invites retaliation and doesn't work out as planned.
Okay, let's move to that really hot topic. Trade, jobs, and wages. The book dives into the data here.
It does. Irwin looks at U.S. employment trends, then checks the relationship between unemployment and import levels.
And finds it's not a simple connection.
Right. Rising imports don't automatically mean rising unemployment. Recessions are a much bigger driver of unemployment spikes, and imports often fall during recessions because overall demand drops. Blaming imports is often too simplistic.
So more imports don't just equal fewer jobs.
Not necessarily. The book cites research finding no systematic link between job churn, jobs created and lost, and how exposed an industry is to trade. It's dynamic. Jobs are lost in some areas, gained in others, like exporting sectors or those using cheaper inputs.
But what about manufacturing? That sector has seen big job losses. How much is due to trade?
Irwin analyzes the factors. Productivity growth, making more stuff with fewer workers, is the biggest factor by far.
Automation, better processes.
Exactly. One study for 2010 attributed something like 87% of manufacturing job losses to productivity gains. Imports accounted for maybe 13%.
Though the import impact varies a lot by industry.
Definitely. Apparel, furniture hit harder by imports. Primary metals, chemicals less so.
What about specific deals like NAFTA? Lots of job loss claims were made there.
Irwin evaluates those claims, points out flaws in the simple calculations often used, like assuming every $1 million of imports costs a fixed number of jobs. It's not that straightforward.
And the actual number of workers getting trade adjustment assistance for NAFTA displacement was relatively small.
Compared to the overall size and churn of the U.S. labor market, yes.
Okay, we often hear about job losses from imports. What about the effect of taxes on imports, on jobs and output?
Irwin discusses research suggesting higher tariffs in the medium term tend to reduce domestic output and productivity. They raise costs, distort markets.
And can lead to higher unemployment.
Yes, and potentially more inequality and a stronger currency, which hurts exports. Interestingly, tariffs often don't seem to have a big impact on the overall trade balance itself.
It's so much more complex than the slogans suggest. What about the trade deficit? The idea that importing more than we export inherently costs jobs.
Irwin tackles that directly. He explains imports don't just subtract from GDP in the way people sometimes think. The GDP calculation subtracts them to avoid double-counting foreign production when measuring domestic spending.
So an import increase doesn't automatically shrink GDP.
Correct. Plus, trade deficits are financed by capital inflows, foreign investment coming into the U.S. That can actually boost funds available for domestic investment.
He mentions the accounting identity. Current account equals savings minus investment.
Right, highlighting the links to broader macroeconomic factors like national saving rates.
What about currency manipulation? The idea that countries keep their currency cheap to boost exports.
Irwin discusses this argument, mentioning China's past accumulation of dollar assets and large surpluses, but he also notes other factors, like China's high savings rate, were crucial. The link between currency value and trade balances is complex.
Did the impact of imports vary depending on which country they came from, like Japan versus Mexico?
Irwin suggests maybe imports from Mexico post-NAFTA were less disruptive than earlier Japanese imports.
Why might that be?
Possibly the types of goods more labor-intensive from Mexico, maybe competing less directly with core U.S. manufacturing then. Plus, the U.S. economy was booming in the 90s, making it easier for displaced workers to find other jobs.
And the big one, the China shock, the surge in imports from China.
Irwin analyzes this carefully. He acknowledges it likely contributed to manufacturing job losses, especially from 1999-2011. But he stresses some other factors, mainly productivity growth, were still responsible for the majority of the overall decline.
He's critical of some studies claiming massive job losses purely from the China trade deficit.
Yes, pointing to methodological issues and the fact that Chinese imports often displaced imports from other countries, not just U.S. production.
And some U.S. industries like toys or apparel were declining before the big China surge anyway.
Right, suggesting longer-term shifts were also happening.
What about wages? How does trade affect wage inequality?
Irwin looks at the rising college premium, the wage gap between college grads and others, especially in the 80s. It leveled off a bit later.
But is trade the main driver of that gap, or things like labor market polarization?
The link between trade and polarization, the hollowing out of middle-wage jobs, isn't clearly established, according to the research Irwin cites. Theory suggests trade could increase demand for skilled labor in rich countries, widening inequality, but the empirical evidence is mixed.
But workers who do lose jobs due to trade often face real wage cuts if they find new work.
That's a real issue. Transitions are hard. Wage losses are common for displaced workers. And it hits local communities hard when job losses are concentrated.
Can lead to lower wages even in local service jobs or people leaving the workforce.
Right. Interestingly, industries facing import competition often cut jobs rather than slashing wages for remaining workers.
What about Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA? Is that program effective in helping displaced workers?
Irwin questions its effectiveness. The rationale is there, efficiency, equity, politics, but the evidence is murky.
Studies suggest trade-displaced workers don't fare that differently from those displaced for other reasons.
That's part of it. And some studies find the TAA program itself has shortcomings, maybe even a negative net benefit per participant once costs are factored in.
Raises questions about the best way to help workers through economic shifts. He mentions place-based policies briefly, too.
Yeah, focusing aid and development on specific hard-hit regions, another approach.
Okay, let's look at trade remedies. Ways countries push back against imports.
Irwin covers the main ones in U.S. law. Anti-dumping duties, AD, countervailing duties, CVD, the escape clause, Section 201, and national security measures, Section 232.
Anti-dumping seems common. How does that work again?
Basically, if a foreign firm sells goods in the U.S. below fair value dumping, and the International Trade Commission, ITC, finds this harms the U.S. industry.
Then extra duties can be imposed.
Right. Calculating that fair value is complex, especially for non-market economies like China, often leading to high dumping margins.
And the key thing is, they only look at harm to the competing U.S. industry, not consumers or other industries using the import.
Exactly. That's a major point.
What are the effects? Do they stop the imports?
They can significantly reduce imports of the specific product from the targeted country and raise its price.
But imports might just come from somewhere else. Trade diversion.
That happens. Or it might even lead to less competition and potentially higher prices domestically. Irwin critiques the process as potentially biased against foreign firms, too.
And countervailing duties, CVD. That's about subsidies.
Yes, CVDs are meant to offset foreign government subsidies that give their producers an unfair advantage and harm U.S. industry.
Then there's the escape clause, Section 201. That's for fairly traded imports causing harm.
Right. It allows temporary relief if a surge in imports, even if fairly traded, is causing serious injury. But the bar is high imports must be the substantial cause, more important than any other factor.
Like the auto industry example in the 80s, where the recession was deemed more important.
Exactly. It got rejected. Section 201 is sometimes criticized as just a protectionist loophole.
And Section 232, national security. That's been used recently.
Yes, allows the president to restrict imports, like the steel and aluminum tariffs under Trump, if they're deemed a threat to national security. Very controversial. Critics see it as protectionism bypassing normal rules.
Does the book give examples of whether these temporary reliefs actually help industries long-term?
It suggests maybe not always. The specialty steel industry kept needing protection. Harley-Davidson recovered after getting protection, but Irwin attributes it more to better management and the economy improving, raises doubts about the long-term fix.
Let's shift to developing countries. The book seems quite positive about trade's role there.
Yes, it contrasts older views that trade might harm developing nations with the modern consensus that openness generally fuels development and cuts poverty. Even Oxfam acknowledges trade's potential benefits.
Is there solid evidence for that?
Irwin cites research comparing globalizing developing countries, those that opened up more, cut tariffs, with non-globalizers. The globalizers saw significantly faster income growth per person.
He gives specific examples.
Yeah, comparing Vietnam's progress, more open, with Myanmar's, less open, or the Arab development trap linked to more closed economies.
And China and India are huge examples, obviously.
Definitely. China's transformation after opening up in 1979, moving away from import substitution, massive poverty reduction.
And emphasis in India, showing how liberalization helped the services sector boom.
Right. Plus other examples like South Korea's shift to openness in the 60s, leading to rapid growth.
But it's not just about opening borders, is it? Other policies matter too.
Absolutely crucial point. Trade liberalization works best with complementary policies and strong institutions. Just cutting tariffs without fixing other things can backfire, like in Argentina or early post-Soviet transitions.
And basic things like infrastructure and efficient customs are vital.
Essential. High trade costs from bad roads or border delays really hold developing countries back.
What about industrial policy? Governments trying to pick winners.
Irwin discusses the debate. East Asia had some successes, Japan, Korea, but attempts elsewhere often failed due to corruption or rent-seeking. Even the successful cases usually involve being open to exports and necessary imports.
What about worries over low labor standards giving an unfair advantage?
Irwin notes the evidence for this being a major driver of trade is limited. The OECD concluded things like productivity and infrastructure matter much more.
And using trade sanctions to enforce labor standards is tricky.
Yeah, potentially harmful to the workers you're trying to help. Complex to implement. The Cambodia Textile Agreement is an example of the potential and the difficulties.
And finally, things like rich country farm subsidies.
Irwin highlights how those, like U.S. cotton subsidies, hurt developing country farmers by depressing world prices.
And tariff structures in rich countries often hit labor-intensive goods hardest, the very things developing countries might export.
Exactly. Creating barriers just where developing countries might succeed. He also briefly touches on fair trade good goals, but questions about its overall effectiveness and assumptions.
Okay, let's look at the global system itself. GATT, WTO,
Right.
trade disputes, regional deals.
Irwin gives the history. JATT after WWII, fostering trade through negotiating rounds. Then the WTO in '95, broader scope, stronger dispute settlement.
But facing challenges recently.
Definitely. Disarray, more trade conflicts like the U.S.-China one.
The U.S. was historically a leader in building this system, right?
Yeah.
Like the RTAA in 1934 shifting power.
Yes, that was key. Paved the way for negotiated tariff cuts. Irwin outlines the major GATT rounds. Overall, the system succeeded hugely in cutting tariffs and establishing non-discrimination, despite challenges like agriculture.
The WTO dispute settlement was meant to be a big improvement. How is that viewed now?
Stronger than GATT's, clearer rules. The U.S. has used it a lot, both bringing cases and defending against them. But the U.S. has become increasingly critical of the system recently.
And the U.S.-China trade war looms large over this whole discussion.
Absolutely. The big tariffs imposed by Trump, China's retaliation, huge disruption, raising questions about the system's future.
The book also mentions non-tariff barriers, like health regulations.
Right. Legitimate rules can sometimes be used as disguised protectionism. Very hard to untangle sometimes, leading to disputes like the EU hormone beef case. Different views on risk, precaution.
And issues like state-owned enterprises in China, creating challenges for WTO rules.
Yes, concerns about unfair advantages and subsidies causing friction.
Finally, regional trade agreements, RTAs, like NAFTA or deals in Europe and Asia. How do they fit in?
Irwin notes that while multilateral deals were important, unilateral reforms by countries themselves actually account for the biggest share of tariff cuts, especially in developing nations.
So RTAs are just one part of the picture. Pros and cons.
They can create trade between members, good, but might divert trade from non-members, less good. They also raise questions about the multilateral principles, like non-discrimination.
And modern deals often go beyond tariffs into domestic regulations.
Yes, criticized by some for potentially benefiting specific interests or limiting national policy space.
So wrapping up our deep dive on free trade under fire, this is super complex. Economic theory, evidence, politics, all tangled up.
Absolutely. Irwin's book gives a really valuable, balanced framework for understanding these long-running debates and the current challenges.
He contrasts President Trump's approach with predecessors like Reagan, who emphasized trade's mutual benefits.
And highlights the U.S.'s historical leadership role in building the post-war trading system, seeing it as vital for peace and prosperity.
A reminder that U.S. choices have big ripples globally.
Definitely.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you, our listener. Given today's global shifts, new powers rising, ongoing debates, what core principles should guide international trade now in the 21st century to promote both prosperity and global stability?
Something to think about, and we definitely encourage you to explore Douglas Irwin's Free Trade Under Fire yourself for a much deeper dive.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive on Books and Bytes.
Thanks, everyone.
I'll catch you next time.